The first night I told myself it was love. The second night I told myself it was duty. By the fifth night, I had stopped telling myself anything. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom we had moved into 4 days after our wedding, listening to the horses shift in the barn below, waiting for it to be over. I was 19 years old. I had been a wife for 6 days. And I had already learned something no one had prepared me for: that in an Amish marriage, a husband's needs do not stop because a wife is exhausted. They do not stop because she is sore. They do not stop because she is still, in every way that matters, a girl who has not yet understood what she agreed to. I grew up Old Order Amish in northern Indiana. I left when I was 24, and everything you are about to hear is true. To understand what happened in that first week, you have to understand what I had been taught marriage was before I entered it. I was raised in a community where the Ordnung governed everything. The Ordnung is the unwritten code, the set of rules and expectations that shapes every corner of Amish life, from the width of a hat brim to the color of a dress to the structure of authority inside a household. And the structure inside a household is not a suggestion. It is not a conversation anyone is invited to have. The husband is the head. The wife submits. That is not a cultural preference in Old Order Amish life. It is theology. It is the air you breathe from the moment you are old enough to understand language. What that means in practice, what it actually looks like inside a bedroom, inside a marriage, inside the first week when two people who are barely strangers suddenly share a life, that part was never spoken aloud. Not by my mother, not by the bishop's wife, not by any of the older women who helped me sew my wedding dress or bake the 300 pies that covered the tables at our reception. The silence around the physical reality of marriage was so complete, so long practiced, that it had its own texture. You could feel it in the way conversations shifted when you moved too close to the subject. You could feel it in the way women glanced at each other across rooms when a young bride walked in and then looked quickly away. I married a man named Solomon. He was 26 when we wed, which in my community made him experienced by reputation and settled by age. He had a farm. He had a house his father had helped him build the summer before our wedding. He had steady hands and a serious face, and a way of speaking that made people listen. He was, by every measure my world offered, a good match. Our wedding was in October. 4 hours of preaching on a hard wooden bench. A meal for 400 people. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, creamed celery, wedding cookies stacked on white plates. By the time Solomon and I were alone that first night, I had been awake for 19 hours. My feet were swollen. My back ached through to the bone. And underneath all of that exhaustion, there was a fear I had no name for. The fear of knowing something was coming and having been given no information whatsoever about what it would be. What happened that first night, I will not describe in full. I will say only this: it was not what I had imagined, because I had not been permitted to imagine anything. It was disorienting and painful and faster than I expected. When it was over, Solomon rolled onto his side and was asleep within minutes. I lay awake for a long time. I told myself, this must be what the first night is. I told myself tomorrow would be different. It was not different. The second night, I was still sore from the first. I said nothing. I had been raised to understand that a wife's body is not her own in the way a single woman's body is. After the vows, something transfers. Not legally, not in any words anyone speaks aloud, but in practice. In the quiet assumption threaded through every sermon about submission, every piece of counsel about being a good helpmeet, every image of womanly faithfulness the community held up for young girls to study and absorb. I understood that Solomon's expectation of me was not separate from his faith. It was an expression of it. And refusing him felt, inside the framework I had been given, like refusing God. So, I did not refuse. By the third night I had begun to understand that this was not going to be occasional. Solomon was a man of strong habit. He woke at 4:30 every morning. He ate at the same times every day. He expected supper on the table at 6. and he expected me to be willing at night. Every night. Not because he was cruel. I want to be careful here because he was not a cruel man in the way that word is usually meant. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply expected, the way he expected breakfast, the way he expected clean clothes. It was that ordinary to him, because no one had ever told him it should be anything else. My friend Ruth had married the year before me. She lived 3 farms over, and we had grown up together, stitched quilts together, attended the same singings. About 2 months after my wedding, we were washing dishes in her kitchen after a frolic, and I was moving carefully, the way you move when your body has stopped feeling like your own. Ruth looked at me for a long moment, and then looked back at the dishes. She said very quietly, without raising her eyes, "Does it ever stop?" I said, "I don't know." "Does it?" She shook her head, barely. And then we went back to washing, and neither of us said another word about it. That was the entire conversation. That was the full depth of what was available to us. A shake of the head over a sink of soapy water, and then silence, because silence was faithfulness, and we had both been taught that since before we could read. Here is what I understand now. After years of therapy and after learning words I was never given inside my community, what Solomon was doing had a name. What the community had taught him to expect had a name. What the Ordnung enforced through silence and theology, and the complete absence of any framework for a wife's comfort or consent, that had a name too. I did not have any of those names when I was 19. I had only the understanding that a good wife endures and a bad wife complains, and I intended with everything I had been raised to be a good wife. The 4th night I lay down beside him and thought about my mother. I thought about the way she moved through her marriage, efficient, capable, unreadable. I thought about whether she had ever felt what I was feeling. I thought about whether she knew. And lying there, I realized that she almost certainly did know. That she had almost certainly felt the same thing in the first weeks of her own marriage to my father, and that she had said nothing to me because no one had said anything to her. The silence had passed from her mother to her and from her to me like an inheritance no one chose, but everyone received. That is the part that still sits heaviest in me. Not what Solomon expected, not even the exhaustion or the pain. It is the silence, the deliberate, theological, generational silence. The way the community had constructed an entire architecture of expectation around a husband's rights, and built not a single wall, not a single door, not a single window where a wife's experience might exist. The 5th night was the night something changed inside me, not in what happened. What happened was the same, but something in the way I experienced it shifted. I had been lying there in the dark in the way I had learned to lie there, waiting, and a thought arrived that I could not have called a thought at the time. It was more like a sensation, a cold, clear recognition moving through me. I thought, I do not want this. That was all. Nothing dramatic. No decision. No plan. Just that quiet, internal sentence arriving in the dark like a fact. I do not want this. And then, immediately behind it, like a door swinging shut. And that does not matter. Because in the world I was living inside, it didn't. A wife's wanting, or not wanting, was not part of the calculation. Solomon was not a man who asked whether I wanted anything, not because he was monstrous. I keep returning to this because it matters, but because the idea that he should ask had never once been placed in front of him. The Ordnung had given him a wife. The bishop had married them. The church had blessed the union. What happened inside the marriage, inside the bedroom, was between Solomon and God. And God, as my community understood him, had placed the husband in authority, had made the wife a helpmeet, had designed this arrangement and called it holy. I stayed in that marriage for 4 years. There were things that were good in it, and I will not pretend otherwise. Solomon worked hard. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He did not disappear or neglect the farm, or leave me without what I needed to manage the household. He was faithful in every way that word was understood in our community. He was by every external measure a good Amish husband. The problem was not Solomon. The problem was what Solomon had been taught a husband was permitted to be. When I finally left, and leaving cost me everything, I will say that plainly, I found myself sitting across from a therapist for the first time in my life. An Englishwoman with kind eyes in an office with houseplants on the windowsill. She asked me to describe my marriage. I described it the way I would describe the weather, matter of fact, without drama, because inside the framework I had been given, none of it was dramatic. It was simply how things were. She listened. Then she said, "What you are describing has a name. 3 words." And I sat there, surrounded by houseplants, and felt something I could not at first identify. It was relief and grief, and underneath both of those things, quiet and cold and enormous, it was rage. Rage at a system that had handed me to a man before I understood what was being handed. Rage at a theology that had named his expectation holy and my discomfort irrelevant. Rage at every woman who had known, and they had known. Ruth with her shake of the head, my mother with her unreadable efficiency, and had said nothing because silence was the only inheritance they had to pass along. I want to be precise about something, because this is the part people outside my community sometimes misread. Solomon did not believe he was doing anything wrong. He had been raised, shaped, preached to, and married inside a system that had never once suggested he ought to consider what his wife wanted. That system is what I am angry at. Not one man. A system. A set of practices and silences and theological assumptions that treated a wife's body as a resource and called that treatment righteousness. In more conservative Amish affiliations, the Swartz and Truber and Troyer communities, some of the stricter Nebraska settlements, these assumptions run even deeper. Wives in those communities have even fewer frameworks, even fewer words, even fewer moments of hearing their experience named as real. In slightly less conservative Old Order districts, there may be marginally more space for a woman to speak, but across most of the communities I know and came from, the expectation is identical. You yield. You are faithful. You endure. And what you endure is never given a name, because naming it would mean acknowledging it exists, and acknowledging it exists would mean the system would have to answer for it. It does not like to answer. What I have now, living outside that system, is words. I have the word for what it is when someone does not ask. I have the word for the expectation that took up residence inside my marriage like a third person I never invited. I have the word for what it costs a woman, year after year, to surrender her body to an obligation she was never given language to question. I hold all of these words with both hands because they were so expensive to find. But I also have this. I do not believe Solomon was evil. I do not believe my mother was a coward. I do not believe the women at the quilting bees, who knew and shook their heads and stayed quiet, were cruel. I believe they were all inside the same sealed room I was inside. A room built by centuries of theology and practice and silence. A room where the windows had been bricked over so gradually that no one could remember when light had last come through. Leaving that room cost me my family. It cost me my community. It cost me the only world I had ever known. It cost me the Meidung, unanswered calls, letters returned with my own handwriting looking back at me from the envelope like a stranger's face. I am not going to tell you the cost was worth it in any clean or simple way, because loss like that does not resolve into a lesson. It just lives alongside you. You learn to carry it differently over time, but you do not put it down. What I will tell you is this. I know what I want now. I know what I do not want. I know that my wanting exists, and that it counts. I know that a marriage is not a transaction in which a wife pays with her body and receives security in return, even if an entire religious tradition has been constructed to make that arrangement feel like God's design. I know that the silence handed to me was not modesty. It was control. And I know the difference now between those two things, because I spent years inside that room and years outside of it, and the air does not feel the same. If you grew up somewhere that told you your body was not entirely your own, that your endurance was faithfulness, that your silence was virtue, that the wanting or not wanting of a woman was simply not relevant to the larger design, I see you. If no one ever gave you a word for what you lived through, if you stood at a sink next to a friend and shook your head and said nothing and called that friendship because it was the most that was available, if you lay awake in a room that smelled of kerosene and hay, and told yourself that this was simply what marriage was because you had been given no other story, I see you. Your experience inside your own life matters. Your body matters. Your wanting matters. And if no one in your world ever said those words to you, I am saying them now as plainly as I know how. I was not too young to cook for 400 people. I was not too young to run a household or tend animals or rise at 4 in the morning and make the day work. I was too young to understand what I was agreeing to when I stood before that bishop. And the community that blessed that marriage knew it and said nothing, because the silence was never incidental. It was the point. That is the whole story. Not what one man demanded, but who taught him he was allowed to demand it, and who taught me I was not allowed to refuse. If any of this found you somewhere real today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your story in the comments when you are ready. These truths belong in the open, not in the walls. Every freedom you step into has weight. Hold it. It may matter more than you know.